Hey there, friends. Long time no see. My name's Popeye. Today we got some more Umineko for everyone. Before we dive into it, this game does have some pretty mature themes that I just want to make sure everyone here is aware of today. This game includes themes such as death, murder, child abuse we saw last time, assault. I can't say for certain if there will be sexual assault, but that is a possibility. And any of those things against a minor. Alright, it's been a hot minute. Trying to actually remember what happened last time in this game. I do remember, well, we've got right here, we find out that George is maybe not so secretly in love with one of the maids at the house. And alright, the big thing, so we started off with Maria trying to find her rose and it wasn't there. And then we all eventually came inside, had dinner, and then at the very end, Maria pulls out of her little purse a letter that she says someone gave to her in the rose garden. And she says it's the witch Beatrice. And then, seemingly as if the witch is speaking to her, she loses all of her normal speaking mannerisms and speaks like an adult, using a different voice, different language that she probably didn't know. Hello, Samuses. I don't think I didn't see that joke subscription. It's only been, what, 2 weeks? If you think this is retirement, then I don't know what you're gonna say when Beardy and Panic stream again, if like we've unearthed like the tomb of some ancient Egyptian pharaoh at that point. But how are you doing? Can I replay it? Let's see. This used to be a feature. No, I don't know why OBS did this. So it used to be an OBS in your feed. You could actually click something and replay it, which was really good for testing purposes, actually. That was maybe my number one reason. Number two is for exactly what you just said, where, you know, sometimes people are in ad hell and don't see what's there. So it was useful to replay. But sadly they took that feature away sometime around version 30 of OBS. Then what? Oh, the adults started having an argument, saying, "Oh, you know, someone's trying to fool us," because Beatrice basically says, "If you solve my riddle, you get to inherit everything. You get to inherit the mansion, the gold, everything." Oh, I'm sorry to hear about your back. I'm doing pretty good. It's been another busy day at work. We had some fires come in. Not like super pressing, but we had one client who wanted some changes to a production push today, and then another client who we do some security patching for them, so that's pretty high priority, so I've got to get that wrapped up by end of week. And there's a bit of confusion there about kind of which pieces we were supporting, but it's all sorted out now. What was I saying? Oh, the adults were arguing, basically saying someone did this to try to put a claim on the inheritance. We as the kids didn't really get to see a whole lot of this. We did see Battler's stepmom basically saying this means that the witch doesn't exist, because they wouldn't... the only person who would have something to gain would be someone who's like not the witch from this. And then the kids are like, "Yeah, we're gonna go do kid stuff," and leave. And then George and what's your name? It's been so long, I don't remember your name. Characters. This is why I have a character sheet. Shannon. And Shannon are having their little rendezvous in this gazebo outside in the rain, where George is talking about what everyone should talk about on their first date, capitalism, and its how money is the most important force in history. I'm sure that he has some metaphor in there, but at face value, just talking about capitalism and history. Yeah, sounds good.
それを理解してから父さんの背中を見ると自分がいかに未熟で父さんがどれほどの切磋琢磨をして今日を築き上げてきたかがよくわかるんだ。
ジョージ様はお父様のことをとても尊敬されているんですね。羨ましいです。
ごめん、別にそういう意味で言ったんじゃないんだよ。
すみません。私も別にそういう意味で言ったつもりは。
The two of them awkwardly looked at their feet. Shannon had no parents. She'd been brought up in a welfare institute owned by the Kinzo called the Gospel House. With the guidance of the honorary director Kinzo, the Gospel House offered excellent students a chance to live a life of service, just what every student really wants. If they were accepted, they would be able to leave the institute and work as a servant for the Ushiromiya family. This was considered to be the highest honor for a student. Servants from the Gospel Ipuen House all took names with the character in on non in them while they served. So Shannon wasn't her real name. The same goes for Canon. All the students of the Gospel House were orphans, or failing that, people who'd been disowned by their parents through some special circumstances. Because of this, the students had been taught to think of each other as their only family. Why it seemed so natural to Canon to call Shannon his sister. They are not blood-related. Important information. Shannon and Canon are not blood-related. Remember this fact. While only Shannon and Canon are working today in the mansion, there were other servants who worked in the ship rotation, named Manon and Lennon, who also inherited the character in their names. However, there were not many servants who stayed with the Ushiromiya family for long. It was standard for them to quit after 3 years. I always say that Shannon, who had been working for over 10 years, was a very rare exception to the rule. Working as a servant for the Ushiromiya family was a heavy burden to bear, but the pay wasn't bad at all. Working for 3 years would earn more than what was needed to enter mainstream society. That's why, even though the students realized what a harsh task working for the Ushiromiya family was, they still hoped to be accepted. In Shannon's case, maybe the fact that she'd managed to continue for more than 10 years should not be viewed as her having more willpower than any of the other servants. Maybe it was the lack of courage to say that she wanted to quit that forced her to continue working for those 10 years. To Kinzo, who could not even trust his own blood relatives, those excellent servants in the Gospel House were the only ones he could trust. So that Kinzo would sometimes allow them to wear the family crest as servants under his direct control and have them work close to him.
もう勤めて10年近くになるんだっけ?
Okay, so information time then. Let's see. Are there any other characters? No. No. No, so it's just the two of them. They mentioned 2 others. Okay. I don't know if this information was here before. That might have been added in as a result of that conversation.
だいぶお金も貯まったんじゃないかい?
どうでしょう。別に私、買いたいものも特にありませんし、ほんの何百万かあったって、それで残りの人生を過ごせるわけもありませんし。
Let's see if I can get this. So 1 million yen in current exchange rate. I think it's you divide roughly by 80, but usually I just round up to 100. So she has several tens of thousands of dollars saved up.
目標の額があってお勤めを続けてるわけじゃないのかい?
そうですね。私はこのお屋敷以外に行くあてもありませんし、お嬢様とも他の使用人の子たちとも仲良くやれてますし、奥様には時折お叱りを受けますけど、バラの世話やお屋敷のお掃除も楽しいですし。
でもそれはシャノンちゃんのサヨちゃんの人生じゃない。
Okay, we might have a real name drop. Shannon cast her eyes downwards when she heard her real name. She understood what George was trying to say and closed her mouth.
僕は成人し社会人になってからも勉強して分かったことが。
Okay, let's see this. Do we now have her real name? No. Oh, there we could see her family crest. Looks like it's tattooed onto her leg.
「子供の頃僕らが思っていたほど人生は単調で短くないんだ。
That horrifying thought that everyone has in their student years. The rest of my life be a monotonous, boring, sleep-inducing after-school class, where I endlessly, lazily while away the time until finally it ends without anything interesting ever happening. However, these thoughts only arise while a person is still an underage student. Compared to a human's life, the time they spend as a student is nothing more than the blink of an eye, just the period before they break out of their shells and cast off their immaturity. The inside of their shell might be a hot, suffocating and boring world. The world beyond that shell is vast and filled with limitless
君の人
possibilities.
生はまだシャノンという殻の中でしかないんだ。君は自分の人生がこの生活のままずっと続いていくと勘違いしてるんじゃ。
それは。
Shannon couldn't deny those words. She hadn't been able to find any concrete issues with her way of life. And since she hadn't any desire or goal to change herself in any particular way, she continued her life idly. If she were asked whether her life was already fulfilled, she wouldn't have necessarily been able to nod. That may have been a truth she was deliberately averting her eyes from. As long as George didn't realize that truth, he would continue pretending not to notice as her real life slipped away, neglected bit by
ジョ
bit.
ージ様、私はこのままでいてはいけないのでしょうか。
いけないよ。あ、それから今ルール違反が一つあったね。
George immediately gave a strict answer and then broke out into a mischievous smile. Shannon already knew what she was being chided for, and it seemed that embarrassed her as she hung her head.
僕たちしかいない時は様はなしの約束だよ。
約束では聞けません。ですが、ご命令でしたら聞かないわけにはいきません。私は家具ですから。
じゃあ命令だよ。
はい、かしこまりました、ジョージさん。
As Shannon hung her head, her face red, she said George's name again, this time using son.
それでいいよ、さやちゃん。
A smile rose to George's face, praising Shannon's, no, Sayo's small act of bravery. The way they talked with each other gave off the sense that the relationship had already been ongoing for some time. For a long while, as the weather raging around them didn't even enter their consciousness, the two of them talked about the many memories they'd built during their relationship that no one else knew about. Every once in a while, a flash of lightning would attempt to dampen the mood, but it could not sully these moments, which seemed to flush even the roses outside a deeper shade of red.
そうだ、君に見せたいものがあって。
なんでしょうか。
George, who had been speaking eloquently, suddenly started to stutter. From his manner, Shannon too understood something. George timidly searched through his pocket for it. Got caught deep in his pocket somehow, and came out somewhat slowly and awkwardly, in the same manner as his speech. It was a very small box. A small box covered in deep blue velvet. Its characteristic shape was enough to make anyone realize what was resting inside. Shannon had been preparing her heart a little, sure of what it must be. Even so, when she actually saw it, she couldn't avoid blushing once more. George opened the small box, took it out, and held it out for Shannon to take.
これを君に受け取ってほしいんだ。
このような高価なものは、お受け取りできません。
受け取れない。
いえ、こんなもの、私には、過ぎていて。
さよ、これはお願いじゃない。命令だよ。この指輪を受け取って。ね。
命令ではした。
うん、そうだね。いい子だよ。
Shannon, not wanting to show her bright red face, timidly accepted the ring from George's hand, still staring at the ground. That ring wasn't a simple accessory. It was a noble object which since ancient times was meant to be offered to a special woman with a special meaning. While George could order her to take it, he could not order anything beyond that. Anything beyond that would depend not on an order, but on Shannon and Sayo's own will.
だから、ここからはもう命令じゃない。さよ、明日までに言葉でない形で返事がもらいたい。わかるね。
どうすれば。
もうこれ以上は命令じゃないから、僕は君に命令はしない。でも、指輪は指にするものだからね。気に入ってくれたなら、好きな指につけてくれればいい。
Shannon had only pretended not to know, but already understood what he wanted her to do. She was standing at a huge crossroads of her
も
life.
うこんな時間だね。今夜はこれくらいにしよう。
George faced away from Shannon, seeming slightly uncomfortable.
君に左手につけてほしいと命令することもできるかもしれない。君も命令されればそれに従えるという臆病な甘えがあるかもしれない。でも最後のここだけは君のさよの意志でしてもらいたいんだ。わかるね。
はい。
だからそれが命令。今夜よく考えて明日その返事を見せてほしい。
Shannon nodded back. Today was the culmination of their long relationship. This moment had not come as any surprise to Shannon.
そろそろゲストハウスに戻ろうか。これ以上遅いとみんなを心配させちゃうよ。
すみません。お屋敷に用を思い出しまして、お屋敷へ行かねばなりません。
こんな時間に本当かな。
George stared at Shannon's face as he laughed mischievously. He'd seen through that obvious lie of Shannon's. Imagining how she felt, it wasn't as if he couldn't understand her embarrassment and why she might ask to be alone. And so George, having understood Shannon's lie and all that was behind it, allowed her to leave. Okay, it's an hour later. We are inside the mansion. Shannon entered the entrance hall of the mansion, the tottering gate. Her chest was filled almost to bursting point with a mixture of exultation and uncertainty that she couldn't easily describe. Stopping for a second in front of the servant room to take a deep breath and calm her heart, she opened the door. Inside, Goda, who'd been ordered to take the midnight shift at the mansion tonight, was absorbed in an old, worn-out crossword puzzle magazine. He looked up for an instant to see whether one of the family had come. When he realized it was a fellow servant, he returned to his puzzle as if nothing had happened.
源氏様より 合田さんのお手伝いにつくように言われてまいり。
ああ、そうですか。それは助かります。そろそろ戸締まりの見回りに行きたかったのですが、ここを開けてもいいものか困っていたのです。何しろ旦那様方の会合はまだだいぶ続きそうですからね。いつ何時お茶のご用命があるかも分かりませんし。
そうですよね。ではどうしましょうか。私が留守番を。
ではシャノンさん、申し訳ありませんが、お屋敷内の見回りをお願いします。私はここで親族の皆さんのご用命の待機をしております。
Just sounds like he doesn't want to do work.
はい。
Shannon felt a twinge of annoyance. Despite the fact she'd come to help out as a favor, she was being forced to do the job of the person actually on duty as though it were the natural. Furthermore, after one-sidedly forcing that task on her, Koda had once again gone back to his magazine and become immersed in his crossword puzzle. For the time being, as a sign of respect for her elder, Shannon bowed her head and left the room to make the rounds. Getting a little angry had enabled her to bring the airy sensation she'd been feeling until now under control a bit. Besides, she couldn't show this kind of face to Genji and Cannon. Until her heart was able to calm down, she wanted a little time to herself, and maybe going around the mansion wasn't such a bad way to do that. In the dining hall, she began to hear the tumultuous voices of the family's discussion. Someone would speak at great length and then be opposed by someone else. That rebuttal would continue in a very long, drawn-out fashion until opposed by yet another person. That kept on repeating. It was as though their displeasure was seeping out through their voices. She'd been told to go to the guest house, so it would be bad if she was discovered by Kraus. Thinking that, Shannon quick-footedly slipped by the entrance to the dining hall. And inside the mansion, controlled by darkness, she began to check that the house was all closed up, following a prearranged route. She walked down the hall, checking that each window was closed. In Orokonjima, there were no humans other than the family. In actuality, closing up wasn't that terribly meaningful of a task. Till Natsuhi had scolded them that this attitude was careless, closing up had not been customary in the Ushiromiya family. Metal fixtures and the completely chilled windows were freezing, and every time she went to check on them, one by one, it felt like the glow in her heart seemed to cool down. Just then, she thought she saw something flickering across the hall. Flickering? Something like that shouldn't be visible beyond the darkness of the hall. Although she thought it was probably her eyes playing tricks on her, she killed her breathing for a brief moment. And grasping a curtain, she fearfully gazed into the center of the hall. However, other than the occasional crack of thunder brightening the hallway, she was unable to glimpse any flicker again. It must have been her imagination after all. Maybe because she couldn't calm her heart. She saw something that didn't even exist. Shin resumed checking the windows. However, in the back of her mind, a certain unnerving possibility had been resurrected. It was that the witch had been passed down amongst the servants who served the Ushiromiya main family, that ghost story. Which the mansion had different masters of the day and the night. Which the master of the night, Beatrice, would sometimes fly around the mansion in the form of sparkling butterflies. Come to think of it, hadn't Canon-kun said that he had once seen it for himself? He got sulky when I didn't believe him and told him he was just seeing things. Could it possibly, really? The roar of the thunder gave no answer. Why are they showing us everyone? They're establishing where everyone is at this exact moment. So you're unknown. Oh, his second portrait of Beatrice in his office. So at that moment, there were 4 people who were alone. Wait, no. Okay, it's now 6 a.m. the next day. I don't like that this is called the sacrifices chosen by the key. Genji once again tightened his bow tie and looked outside through a crack in the curtains. Maybe the rain had died down a tiny bit since the previous night, but it didn't look like the thick rain clouds were planning to let any trace of the morning sun get by. The morning was dim and far from refreshing. Before we go any further, so who was alone at that time? Ginzo was. All the adults were together. Kids were together. I don't recall seeing Maria. Maybe Maria was supposed to be asleep, but in the kids' room? You were alone. You were alone. You were alone. So everyone on the outside of this L was alone at that moment.
お待たせしました、源氏様。
Gannon finished checking his appearance and exited the washroom. The normal schedule, it was rare to have someone having to suffer going straight from a midnight shift to a morning shift. It's a special system for just the 2 days of the family conference. Then, as long as the typhoon didn't leave today, the relatives stay on this island would last until tomorrow. Gannon thought it was best to prepare for the special schedule to be extended one more day. The two of them left the guest house, opening their umbrellas. The rose garden had been devastated by the wind and rain last night. Even though they'd spent several days making it beautiful to welcome the guests, it had only taken one stormy night to ruin it. Gannon sighed. The two headed for the mansion. They were supposed to meet up with Godet and prepare breakfast. Godet was such a perfectionist that he would undoubtedly have been up for some time already, in the middle of preparing a breakfast both exquisite and as elegant as glasswork. They reached the overhang by the entrance to the mansion and folded up their umbrellas. Genji took from his pocket a bundle of several keys and used to unlock the front door. There was nothing on Rokenjima outside of the Ushiromir family mansion, so there never used to be a custom of locking up. For Natsuki had ordered that it be part of their duties to lock up the mansion from around midnight to early morning. Unlocking in the early morning was to be done by the servant who had the morning shift. As Goto would begin the preparations for breakfast as soon as he woke up, this task was to be undertaken by Genji and Cannon. Silence had fallen on the mansion, giving the impression that the mansion itself was still asleep. Okay, other important information here. The mansion was locked. Welcome back, Samuses. We are taking important information down. The mansion was locked this morning, so assuming that Shannon locked it the previous night, and that no one else has a key, that means no one outside of the mansion was able to go in and out without forcing their way in. Assuming that Shannon had actually locked everything up.
では、朝の仕事を始めよう。
はい。
The two of them split up and began opening the curtains throughout the mansion. The curtains remained closed, the inside of the mansion would be unable to shake off its gloom, as if it hadn't yet to escape the previous night. Were you able to reseat all the RAM properly? Cannon, following a well-versed procedure, went around the mansion, opening one window after another without having to retrace his steps once. Even with this horrible weather, by opening the curtains, it began to feel just a little bit like morning. Okay, nice. Hopefully that all works out. While doing that, he passed in front of the kitchen. Even though he hadn't smelled anything yet, his empty stomach started aching in anticipation of the scent of Gota's much bragged about cooking.
おはようございます。
Tried to greet Gota, who he had thought would be preparing the meal inside the kitchen, but Gota was nowhere to be seen. The kitchen was darkly lit, and never mind the curtains, the ventilation fan wasn't even spinning. It was still cold in the room without a hint of flame, and of course no preparations for breakfast were taking place. Although it must not be allowed to happen, maybe Gota had overslept. Servants are humans too. They can sometimes fail to wake up or something and be late as a result. A rare case of that happening, it was the virtue of a servant to casually smooth the situation over so as not to cause an unsightly scene. And to make sure that their masters never noticed that such a mistake happened in the first place. Cannon took up the receiver of the phone, put it on the wall, and dialed the extension number for the room where the servant slept. He couldn't hear the characteristic sound of the dial tone. Cannon tried picking up the receiver again, but even so, he couldn't hear the usual dial tone. Tried dialing again, but it had no apparent effect. Could it be that the lightning last night had caused a mechanical fault and broken the internal telephone lines? The equipment in this mansion was all worn out. Cannon fully understood that even the smallest thing could have caused it to break down. Cannon gave up trying to wake him with the phone and dashed off to the room where the servant slept. How long had she slept until? How long had it been since she had awoken and started lazily staring at the ceiling? A vague sense of awakening was Natsuki's usual morning experience. Her sleep was always light. She wouldn't have even been able to sleep at all without medicine. Natsuki sleeping was definitely not a happy thing. She looked outside. She saw it was still pouring. She hadn't sensed a tiny amount of light. She had mistakenly thought that it was still the last night. She herself was one of the hosts, so she mustn't wake up later than her guests. Urging herself on, she raised up her body, which hadn't completely recovered from yesterday's weariness. While she was inside this room, no one would torment her. Her headache wouldn't get any worse than it already was. This room was her only peaceful space. So when she left it, it meant returning to the world of her husband's siblings, probing each other's minds. Then wouldn't it be better to just stay locked up in this room forever? Natsuki smiled bitterly at this fantasy. She was starting to sound like Kinzo. Even though most of the time she would call Kinzo names for staying locked up in his own room and taking no notice of anyone, the truth was that she actually longed to do that so herself. Natsuki gave her head a small shake, and her fantasy was replaced by the reawakening of her usual headache. When she reached for the doorknob, trying to leave the room, her hand touched the scorpion charm that she'd hung from it before going to sleep the previous night. It was Maria's charm that Jessica had given Natsuki. If she remembered correctly, Jessica had said something about having the power to repel magic and that she should hang it from her doorknob. Maybe it was thanks to that charm that at least this room had been protected from her husband's siblings' malice. She thought this, her mood began to get a little more cheerful.
ジェシカのおかげで少しはゆっくり眠れたということかしら。
Then Natsuki remembered. That's right, I promised last night that I promised Jessica that I would give her a charm of my own in exchange for this one, didn't I? Natsuki opened up a drawer of her dresser and took out an antique accessory case that she treasured ever since she was a child. Inside there were many small objects that Natsuki were thought valuable at the time. From amidst those she pulled out a red pouch. Inside was a small, round mirror about 10 centimeters across. It looked quite old, but the design on the back of the mirror was very ornate, and it felt like something with historical value. At the very least, it looked much more effective when compared to the other charms, which looked like a plastic scorpion key holder. It heard that this mirror was a spiritual mirror, to ward off evil spirits, and she'd been given it specifically by her grandmother when her grandfather's mementos were distributed. It had been believed that since ancient times that strange powers dwell within mirrors. Just likely the way that they reflect light created a belief that they also deflect misfortune and malice in the same way. Natsuhi returned the mirror to its pouch. It would probably be a fitting object to hand over to Jessica. Just as she was placing it in her pocket, the sound of someone knocking on the door suddenly echoed throughout the room.
おはようございます、奥様。早朝から申し訳ございません。
今行きます。何事ですか？
No servant had ever come to her this early in the morning, especially not directly. Maybe something bad had happened. For example, maybe some fatal oversight had been made during the preparation for breakfast and the household would be put to shame in front of the guests or something. So he breathed out slowly as if getting a head start on the troubles he was surely about to be told of. She opened the door. Genji once again said a morning greeting to her while bowing deeply. So he tentatively
お
responded.
はようございます。何かありましたか？
申し訳ございません。昨夜の落雷で電話機器に故障が出たようです。内線電話が不通になっておりますもので、直接のお伺いになってしまったことをお許しください。
内線電話が普通？それは面倒になりましたね。修理は可能ですか？
残念ながら故障箇所がわかりません。後で業者を呼んで修理させたいと思います。
ということは、この台風が過ぎるまでは修理不能ということですか？つまり、客人たちの滞在中はずっと普通ということですね。客人たちのお世話に支障は
出ないよう最善を尽くします。
結構です。粗相のないようよろしく頼みます。
Natsuhi let out a small sigh of relief. He had been prepared for the worst. The telephone breakdown wasn't the kind of trouble she was worried about. Then, even this would probably be enough to spark sarcasm from Eva. Natsuhi gave her head a light shake.
朝食の準備は順調ですか？
それがゴーダの姿が見えません。朝食の支度もまだ行われておらず。
何ですって？
Natsuhi was indignant. To her, this was a much bigger problem than the phones not working. Despite that, this piece of information was the part that had been postponed. Why did everything go well most of the time, then come to something like this when the relatives were visiting? Natsuhi placed a hand to her forehead and shook her head sharply.
大方朝寝坊でもしているのでしょう。とにかく誰でもいいから急いで朝食の準備を。
Natsuhi had exited the hall and turned around for a second to close the door to her room. The unpleasant thing that she saw there was silencing her completely. It was an unsettling sight, as if someone had dipped their fingers in a dark red liquid and clawed at the area around the doorknob. As someone had soaked both of their hands in blood and groped at the door and the knob. Someone had wanted to stage something like that and left this mark as an awful prank.
これは悪趣味な。
私も今ここにお伺いして初めて気づきました。後ほど清掃。
大方趣味の悪い客人の冗談でしょう。不愉快です。実に不愉快です。
Who in the world would pull such a childish and disgusting prank? So we had a pretty good idea, but of course there was no proof. Even if she pushed the issue, it would seem as though she was making a fuss about nothing. Contrary, it would definitely be better for her to say she hadn't even noticed that such a prank had been played in the first place. So he gave the order to have it cleaned and headed off to the parlor with clacking heels. Natsuhi and Genji arrived at the parlor. Eva and Hideyoshi were already there.
おはようございます。みな。
おはよう、夏日さん。朝食も合田さんが作るっちゅう話やないか。朝から胃袋が大喜びで騒ぎっぱなし。
本家の楽しみは食事くらいがせいぜいですものね。
エヴァさんも朝からご機嫌がよろしいようで。
Natsuhi returned Eva's gaze, which was fiercely competitive even though it was early in the morning, with a weary expression. Then Cannon jogged in. After bowing an apology to the relatives for running inside the mansion, he approached Genji and told him something in a small voice.
カノン、 ゴーダはまだ見つからないのですか？
申し訳ございません、奥様。お屋敷内もゲストハウスも回ったのですが、まだ。
一体どこへ行ったというのです？とりあえず今はゴーダより朝食の準備が先決です。至急対応しなさい。
はい。
Kenan glanced at Genji, looked like he had something else to report, but needed to ask Genji whether he was the right person to say it. Genji nodded and decided to give the report himself.
奥様、ゴーダだけではありません。旦那様の姿もありません。
主人が？
はい。奥様より先に旦那様に朝食の準備がないことをご報告しようと思い、寝室をお伺いしたのですが、お姿がありませんでした。それから旦那様だけではありません。ルドルフ様ご夫妻とローザ様のお姿もありません。
ゲストハウスにも屋敷にもですか？
はい。
Okay. Let's pull this up. So who's missing? That we know of. So Goda is missing. Rosa is missing. Kraus is missing. And Rudolph is missing. So, I mean, first thing that tells us is 1, 2, 3 of the 4 kids are missing. Which means if you're looking at this from an inheritance point of view, Eva would now be set to gain everything.
Guest houseの部屋にもおられません。
You heard that Goat alone was missing. She thought that he might have slept in or was loafing around somewhere. She heard that several of the relatives were also missing. She began to start thinking a little more optimistically. Last night's family conference might have continued all night, and in fact still be going on. It would then be imaginable that they'd wanted to cool off their heads after being in that stuffy room, and had gone off on a group walk throughout the rain. The part about cooling off their heads really seemed like something Kraus would like to say. Probably Goda had been called to go with him to aid with something. Goda was not a man who lost track of time. He had to have understood that if he did not return, the preparations for breakfast would be hindered. So perhaps, as much as he'd like to leave, the atmosphere would not permit him to, and the conference was continuing in that manner, even until this very moment. Yes, Natsuki thought this to be an extremely persuasive theory. Natsuki remembered the illusion that she felt in the morning of being sucked into a continuation of the previous night. On learning that the feeling wasn't just an illusion, she once again let out a deep, weary breath. The banquet of the filthy vultures circling around Kinza's property was still continuing.
大方、庭園のどこか、あるいは海岸の方で相も変わらず遺産の話を繰り返しているのでしょう。とにかく、ゴーダを呼び戻さなくては、いつまでも朝食の準備が整いません。
ってことはなんや、兄さんたちの話し合いはまだ続いとるんか。
She thought she'd spoken in a small voice, but Hideyoshi had overheard her and managed to grasp the situation.
兄さんもルドルフもタフね。ローザの場合は若さかしら。私たち、夕べの24時過ぎにはもう眠くてベッドに戻らせてもらったんだけど、確かにあの時点でも、まだ兄さんたちは熱論を交わしてたわ。男って、熱くなると嫌ね。
Sue snorted, her face still blank.
カノン、表を探してらっしゃい。ゴーダを見つけたら、すぐに戻って朝食の準備をするよう伝えなさい。
かしこまりました。
夏日姉さん、表とは限らないわよ。お父様の書斎ってことはないかしら。
なるほど。考えられん話やないで。どういう話の流れかはわからんが、お父さんの書斎に場所を移してお父さんにも混じってもらって議論を続けてるっちゅう可能性は十分あるやろ。
そのような汚らわしい話題を好んでお父様が書斎へ招き入れることなど考えられ。
あらそう。じゃあ仕方ないわね。源氏さんとカノン君は申し訳ないけど外を探してきてちょうだい。確かに兄さんなら頭を冷やすために外を散歩しようなんて言い出しても不思議はないわ。たとえこんな天気でもね。 私はお父様の書斎に行ってくるわ。ひょっとするとそこにいるかもしれないしね。
客人であるエヴァさんにそこまでのご足労はおかけできません。私が行ってきます。朝のご挨拶も兼ねて。
あら、じゃあお願いするわね。でも朝の挨拶を交わしてくれるかは疑わしいわね。夏日姉さんってお父様とは仲よろしかったかしら？
仲が良いかは分かりかねますが、後宮家の跡継ぎの妻を許されるだけの信頼を得ていると確信しています。
ならきっと返事くらいはしてくれるわね。お父様とは朝食くらいご一緒したいの。ぜひ降りてきてくださるよう説得してくれないかしら？私たちはすっかり嫌われちゃってるみたいだけど、そこまで信頼を得ている夏日姉さんの言うことなら聞いてくれそうですもの。そこまで短歌を切ってお父様を説得できず一人で降りてきちゃったりしたら、信頼を得ているなんて二度と言えないかもね。
自信はありませんが、努力。
Natsuki responded discouraged. However, knowing Kinzo's temperament, she had absolutely no confidence in her ability to bring him out. Eva herself was treating it like a joke, expecting that it couldn't be done. But even so, Natsuki would lose face if she gave up, said it was impossible for her, and let Eva go instead. Eva's mean-spirited and unreasonable demand caused Natsuki's tightly clenched fist to shake. When Genji realized this, he softly spoke to her over her shoulder.
奥様、よろしければこれをお持ちください。
それは
Genji handed Natsuki a sparkling gold key of ornate design, key to Kinzo's study. The study would always lock itself and couldn't be unlocked as long as Kinzo forbade entrance. However, since Genji was especially trusted by Kinzo, he was allowed to carry a key to that
でも
door.
この鍵を使ったら
親方様は深くお休みになられている時、それに親方様にお部屋を出ていただくよう説得するにはぜひお使いください。
源氏。
Until now, Natsuki thought of Genji as a cold servant who worked directly under Kinzo and would never work for her. It looked like she would have to alter her understanding of him. She wanted to communicate her feelings of thanks, but by then Genji had already turned his back on her and walked down the corridor with Cannon. As Natsuki watched them go, the words that reached her from behind were sneering.
じゃあお父様を必ず連れてきてね。息子のかわいい嫁の言うことですもの。きっと聞いてくれるわよ。私たちは客人だからここでのんびりくつろがせてもらうわ。
予算かえば口が過ぎるで。すまんが夏日姉さん、お父さんのことをよろしく頼むわ。
Natsuki left without replying. At a swift pace, her heels clapped loudly with every step. After all that excitement the previous night, there's no way anyone was going to wake up soon. George, Aniki, Jessica, and I were all snoring loudly on the bed in the cousin's room. But Maria, who didn't join in and who had gone straight to bed the previous night, suddenly and completely opened her eyes. As she rubbed her sleepy eyes and looked around, the loud snoring coming from the three cousins continued. For a while, Maria had to think about what had happened. After that, she realized that her mother was not with her and quickly got lonely. Maria left the cousin's room, trying to head to the room that had been arranged for her and her mother. Paying no heed to the three who were sleeping soundly, she made a loud slamming sound on the way out. In response, Battler mumbled and rolled over in his sleep, but it wasn't enough to wake him up. After a while, Maria returned, once again opening the door with a lively bang. She had left the room, her face had been sleepy, but after returning, she now looked discontent. After that, she climbed up onto Battler's bed, which happened to be the closest, and started yelling and jumping on it like it was a trampoline.
なんだ敵襲か回せ
Making sure I was awake, Marie jumped over in Georgia Aniki's bed and started bouncing on that too. In that manner, the three of us were all greeted with an extremely pleasant awakening.
ありがとう、マリアちゃん。起こしてくれたんだね。僕たちは夕べが遅かったから寝坊しちゃったのを起こしてくれたんだね。でも、もう少しだけ起こし方を優しくしてくれると完璧だったかな。
ジョージ兄さんは本当に大人だよ。尊敬するぜ。
もうすぐ7時なんだな。ま、確かにもう起きてもいい頃だぜ。
ローザおばさんが部屋にいなかったの？もう起きてお屋敷の方に行っちゃったのかな。いない。
Maria kept groaning and looking unhappy. It seemed like she wasn't simply lonely because she couldn't find her mother, but was actually unhappy because her mother wasn't in the place that she thought she was. It made her feel like she'd been tricked. If we could have just told her where her mother was, that might have been enough to satisfy her, but unfortunately, as long as we were here, we had no way of finding that out.
どうせ朝食に行くことになるんだし、屋敷の方に行こうぜ。
そうだな。マリア、一緒に屋敷へ行こうぜ。きっとローザおばさんもそこさ。
おお、ママはお屋敷なら行く。おお。
そうだね。お屋敷に行こうか。多分親たちはもう向こうに行ってるんだよ。
Maria regained her usual composure, as though her earlier temper had never happened. She got dressed, left the room, and headed for the mansion. The door to the study was once again knocked upon, but there was no answer. He was still sleeping. She couldn't wake him. She returned downstairs saying something like that Eva would be very amused and triumphant. Aside from the whole Eva issue, there was also the problem that yesterday, during this once-a-year family conference, he had stayed locked up all day and had still not come out to greet the guests. Even though he was the head, no, especially because he was the head, he couldn't fail to make an appearance. Did she convince him? So he read to herself and then used the key she had borrowed from Genji, opened the door. A sweet stench seemed to eat into her brain, poured from the narrow opening she'd created, and though she was prepared for it, she couldn't help but grimace. Thinking that he might still be sleeping, Natsuki entered the room quietly. When she did, Kinzo, already awake, was looking down out of the window.
お目覚めでしたか。おはようございます。
どうやって入ったのか。
Kinzo spoke with his back still facing her. His voice was not harsh but calm, and Natsuki was slightly reassured. However, he was at least in a bad enough mood that he had ignored the sound of all that knocking even though he'd been awake. Natsuki wasn't able to break the
申
tension.
し訳ございませんでした。源氏さんにお願いして書斎の鍵をお借りさせていただきました。
ほう、源氏がか。我が友がそれに足ると思ったならば話を聞かぬわけにもいくまい。して私に何言おうか。
はい、もうじき朝食の準備が整いますが、ぜひお父様にもおいでいただきたく思いまして。
朝食はここでとる。いつものように運ばせるがいい。
しかしお父様、年に一度の親族会議です。せめてお顔をお見せになってください。
下に降りて私の死後遺産をどのように食いちぎるのかを決める議論に加われというのか。バカらしい。そのような話は私を抜きで好きに進めるがいい。そしてそれが親族会議だというなら私がこの部屋を出るほどの価値はない。私は忙しいのだ。構うでない。
With his last words came the threat that any further questions would be useless. Natsuhi realized that adding any further pleas would finally bring his wrath down upon her. Annoying to hear Eva sarcastically say that she hadn't been able to convince him after all, but there was nothing more Natsuhi could do.
そうですか。わかりました。みんな残念がるでしょうが、そう伝えます。
Natsuhi decided to give up. Bowing silently, she made to leave the room before Kinzo's spasmodic temper could fire up. As she did, Kinzo called out to her. Compared to the usual Kinzo, this voice was calm and gentle, like it came from another person.
夏日、後ろ宮の家に嫁ぎ、もう随分になるな。
はい。後宮を名乗ることを許されてから、もう随分になります。
前の家が恋しくなることもあるか。
いいえ、嫁ぐとは、成果を捨てることです。私は後宮夏日、帰る家も懐かしむ家も、すべてはこの後宮の家のみです。
It was definitely not an exaggeration. Such was the role of Natsuhi's resolve in calling herself an Ushiromiya. That was why she was so sorrowful that despite all her effort, it had been fruitless that she could not even be accepted by her husband.
クラウスが女で、お前がいや、それは言うまい。
それはどういう意味ですか、お父様。
Natsuhi was shocked. Kinzo's words just now had been meant literally. It would have been more than enough to make up for all she had suffered up until that point.
年寄りのざれ言だ。
Kinzo once again faced away from her. But he had told her to forget it, but Natsuhi couldn't help feeling a warmth in her heart.
お父様、この夏日は血はつながらずともお父様の娘です。後宮家の名誉も栄光も、そしてお父様が残されたものもすべてこの夏日が必ずや守ってみせますから。
お前に片翼のわしをまとう資格はない。しかしお前の心には確かに片翼のわしが刻まれている。ならばお前は間違いなく我が血族で後宮家の栄光を引き継ぐものだ。お前の衣服にわしがないことを嘲笑う者もいよう。しかしそれに耳を貸すことはない。心にわしを持つ者だけが真の私の血族なのだ。お前を後宮家に迎えられたことを今は光栄に思っている。
Without saying anything more, Kinzo remained with his back to Natsuhi. But for Natsuhi, he couldn't help but feel something warm well up inside her that she hadn't felt since long ago when she was just a child. Natsuhi bowed silently to his back and left the room.
あら、ちょうどいいタイミングだったわね。お父様の様子はあんまり遅いから様子を見に来ちゃったのよ。
Natsuhi left the study. She saw Eva climbing the stairs and their eyes met. Eva was smirking unpleasantly, thinking that Natsuhi had just left the room, trudgingly after failing to convince Kinzo. However, the way Natsuhi was now, such a frivolous laugh would not disturb her. She was not permitted to wear the family crest in her clothing, but she was permitted to wear it in her heart. And so she spoke calmly, clearly, and confidently, with the dignity of the one who would protect the glory of the Ushiromiya family.
お父様は親族会議にはおいでにならないそうです。汚らわしい議題に関心はないと仰せです。
とかなんとか言っちゃって。お父様を説得できなかったんなら素直にそう言えばいいじゃない。
哀れですね。お父様が嘆かれるお気持ちもわかる。
それはどういう意味よ。
Natsuhi did not answer. Just as Kinzo had done earlier, she showed Eva her back as she headed down the stairs. Struggling to gather what had happened, Eva could only determine that she had been made fun of, and something had happened to quickly bolster Natsuhi's confidence. Even so, she didn't have the courage to risk Kinzo's wrath. Unable to even knock on the door, she could only scratch the air in front of it, clucking her tongue, and fall after Natsuhi.
それで兄さんたちはいたの？お父様に聞いたの？
聞きそびれましたが、書斎の中にはいませんでした。お父様が夫たちの下船な話のために入室を許すこともありえませんから、下に降りて使用人たちが探してくれるのを待ちましょう。朝食は遅れますが、お茶でもいかがです？エヴァ。
別に結構よ。
Eva couldn't hide her confusion over the complete difference in Natsuki's demeanor. He was acting so boldly, and while Eva hated to admit it, she even had a sense of dignity about her. Unable to find fault with anything, she could only follow Natsuki back to the parlor. When the two of them returned to the parlor, not only Hideyoshi but the 4 children and Nanjo as well had gathered there. Genji had been talking with Hideyoshi, reported the current situation. When he noticed that Natsuki had
主人
returned,
たちはまだ見つからないのですか？
はい、申し訳ございません。あと熊沢が朝食の準備に入りました。もう少し時間をいただきたいとのことです。
clock read a little past 8 a.m. 8 o'clock was the time that breakfast was supposed to have started. The mere fact that the host had gone over that time limit was a disgrace under normal
今
circumstances.
カノンが表を探しています。それからシャノンの姿も見えません。
シャノンまで？まったく。主人は何を従えて散歩に出かけたのですか？
How many people couldn't be found? The number of people having grown so large, it was starting to feel truly unpleasant, as though they were the only ones being left out on something interesting. At the very least, it looked like the children, no, Maria especially, felt the same way. She was indignant, her stomach grumbling, as though her mother and the others had left her to go off alone and eat something delicious without her. I can't say I have anything in particular. Usually I just open up and do some compressed air. Making sure I wipe down all the fan grates and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Like, if that's what you're looking for, yeah, everything's gonna be expensive. If you're looking for someone like with a compressor, like maybe there's someone who will like professionally like do it, who already has the air compressor, and that like, it's still gonna be expensive, but it's gonna be less expensive than buying the air compressor. Trying to fix her bad mood, the other children were flipping through the channels on the television, trying to find a program that might interest Maria. Nando was sitting on the sofa, gazing blissfully at the children while reading a book. No doubt it was a book about chess. Ah, I see. Sound of footsteps came rushing towards them with a pitter-patter. It was only one set, so they realized before they saw the source was not Kraus, the rest, but probably Cannon.
奥様、失礼します。
その様子では見つけられなかったようですね。
申し訳ございません。まだ。
もう十分です。ご苦労をかけました。
They didn't know where they were, but they had to be somewhere on this island. They hadn't put anything in their mouths since last night, so their stomachs must be growling about now. They would surely saunter in any time now. Natsuki was already dumbfounded, and she'd begun to think that there was no urgent need to find them
私はお
right
客
then.
様方にお茶のご用意をしに厨房へ行きます。二人とも早朝からご苦労様でした。
Natsuki, acting as though the release intention caused a new surge in her headache, left the parlor. Cannon tried to call out to her as she left, but Natsuki departed swiftly.
まだ何かあるのか？
はい。旦那様方のお姿を見つけることはできませんでしたが、
Cannon sounded evasive. He still didn't know where they were, but maybe he'd found something with some relation to that. Even Hideyoshi noticed this exchange of words that came over. They'd probably noticed the slightly strange way Cannon was acting.
どうしたんや、カノン君。クラウス兄さんたちは見つかったんか？
実はバラ庭園の倉庫の様子がおかしいのです。
様子がおかしいというのはどういう意味だ？
それが何と説明すればいいのか。
And once again hesitated. He wasn't speaking anything like you'd expect from the usually fearless Cannon. Even Hideyoshi exchanged quizzical looks at this display.
どういうこと？倉庫の中に兄さんたちがいたんじゃないの？
いえ、中はこれから調べます。その鍵を取りに戻ったところなんです。
ようわからんが、とにかく中を調べればいいだけの話やないか。その倉庫の鍵はどこにあるんや？
使用人室にあります。すぐに中を確かめましょう。
Cannon dashed off to the servant room and returned with the key. Genji left the parlor, saying he'd go check, but even Hideyoshi also followed. What was this something odd about the storehouse that had caused the usually fearless Cannon to hesitate? It was still pouring outside, but their curiosity over the something that Cannon couldn't talk about won out. The children made a big fuss watching television. Cannon and the rest dashed off to the entrance. The Rose Garden storehouse was a place that housed various tools to manage the garden. Definitely not a pretty building, because of its appearance it had been built hidden in the corner of the Rose Garden. Cannon, Genji, Iba, and Hideyoshi came cutting across the Rose Garden holding umbrellas. They entered a small path just off the Rose Garden. It was not used by those simply appreciating the garden, but only by those maintaining it. They dashed further along. The front of the storehouse came into view. It was a very old shed of a storehouse, and compared to the flawlessly perfect beauty of the Rose Garden, it was pretty seedy looking. It's easy to understand why it had been built in a hard-to-see place. Even Hideyoshi arrived at the storehouse long before Cannon and Genji.
カノン君たちは早いな。わしは心臓が爆発しそうや。
こんなところに倉庫なんか建ててたのね。何よそれ。
Eva looked where Cannon was pointing. She was at a loss for words. Noticing this, Hideyoshi also followed Cannon's finger and was likewise too shocked to speak. The entrance to the storehouse was a kind of shutter. Everyone there now understood why Cannon had been unable to find words that could describe what he saw. On the shutter, which was completely filthy from being exposed to wind and rain for so long, plastered on it, something that looked like a strange, dark red liquid. Mucus, maybe some sticky paint. Some kind of ghastly substance had been used to draw an indescribably eerie shape. Rain had caused it to drip down in several places, like fresh blood leaking from an open wound. Yeah, this is Devour. We just finished the intro, so we're just about to unleash the thing that's going to hunt us. There was no longer any point in being choosy with words. A ghastly dark red substance meant to look like blood had been used to draw some kind of figure or mark, intended to suggest something ominous. 2 concentric circles were drawn there, and inside of them was a design that looked like a cross. 4 ends of the cross were widely exaggerated and looked like some kind of crest from somewhere around Europe. In the cracks between the shapes, written closely packed together, were some unfamiliar characters, possibly symbols.
なんちゅう悪趣味な落書きや。これあれか？悪魔の儀式とかの魔法陣いうやつとちゃうか？
Reference to this ghastly shape, drawn with a deep red, dripping substance, Hideyoshi's comparison was not unreasonable.
これいつ書かれたの？
昨日雨が降り出す前にここに来ましたが、その時には何も書かれてませんでした。
他の方々の目に触れる前に何とかしよう。ご覧になられたら誤解になられる。
そうね、ただの倉庫小屋とはいえ こんな気持ち悪い落書きを1秒たりとも放置したくないわ。
倉庫の中に塗料もあります。応急処置でとりあえず塗り消して後日天気のいい日に改めて塗装しましょう。
How are you doing? It's already wet and dripping. Wouldn't it just be easier to wipe it off rather than paint over it? Andrew remembered that he had recently seen another piece of graffiti, and that too, made with a strange dark red substance of the same color as this. That must have been... That's right, he'd seen it on the door to Natsuki's room.
カノン君、さっさとこの落書きを消して戻りましょう。たとえ倉庫とはいえ、実家の落書きは本当に腹立たしいわ。
はい、すぐに済ませますので。
And squatted in front of the shutter and unlocked it. He lifted it up with all of his strength. Boisterous noise resounded, and the eerie shape drawn on the shutter began to get sucked into the top of the shutter as the top was raised. At least for the time being, that ominous thing disappeared from the direct gaze, and they all breathed a sigh of relief. Thanks to a kids program that had come across, Maria was feeling much better, because Maria didn't know about demonic blood circles outside. Battler and Jessica were making fun of the kids program at every turn, cackling. George was enjoying the program along with Maria. Nanjo sat on the sofa by himself, passing the time by reading quietly. They heard hurried footsteps come from the hallway. Footsteps from a single person. Does that mean that it wasn't the group of 4 that had just left? Genji was the one who had returned. It was very rare for Genji, considered being out of breath a violation of servants' virtues. Be gasping for air. Probably come dashing back from outside the mansion. His shoulders were soaking wet, and he didn't have his usual smart appearance. When Genji noticed Nanjo looking at him, he gave a small silent bow and quickly approached him.
申し訳ございません。至急お越しください。何事ですかな?
Genji whispered something into Nanjo's ear. Nanjo's face changed color. He stood from the sofa, trying not to be noticed by the children, who were all engrossed by the TV. 2 of them rapidly left the parlor, muffling their footsteps. Just as they were leaving the parlor, they came across Natsuki, who was pushing a serving cart loaded with the tea set. Genji whispered something to Natsuki's ear, and Natsuki's face too changed color, shocked. Then, leaving the serving cart where it was, the 3 of them started dashing towards the entrance. George noticed them running down the rose garden through the window.
なんだろう、源氏さんと南條先生と、あれは夏日おばさんかな。
どうしたんだよ、兄貴。
何かあったのかな。ひどい慌てようだったね。
Jessica and Maria also realized that something was happening from the fact that Eva, Hideyoshi, and Nanjo were no longer in their seats, because the serving cart had been abandoned at the entrance to the parlor.
何か事故でもあったとか？
行ってみようぜ。俺たちだけのけ者なんて面白くねえしな。
I don't know if that's how you should be reacting to someone saying maybe there was a medical accident. For some reason, what Battler said sounded extremely indiscreet. But they couldn't deny that they were a little insecure and concerned after seeing the adults run off into the rain, disregarding their appearance.
行ってみようぜ。何があったか気になるぜ。
Jessica's insecure words spoke for all of them.
おい、マリア。お前も来るか？それとも、テレビを見てるか？
マリアはテレビがいい。
So we're leaving her alone. I'm sure this will work out great for her. Yeah, take care, Sam says. Have a great sleep. Yes, I am telling you what to do.
僕たちだけで行こう。マリアちゃん、 テレビを見て待ってるんだよ。
By the time the kids went outside, they'd lost sight of the adults who had left earlier. It looked like Jessica, who had a pretty good idea of where they were going, had gone from the direction they'd been running. Following Jessica, they ran through the rain-soaked rose garden. It felt like the wind suddenly got stronger. The malicious sound of thunder began to ring out like it had the previous night. It felt like something eerie had surrounded the island and was trying to stop them from moving forward.
Jessica, この先には何があるんだ？
確か園芸道具なんかの倉庫があったはずだぜ。
そんなところに一体何があるんだろうね。
Just as Jessica said, a storehouse came into view in front of them. They could see the adults were there. The shutter to the storehouse was open, and several of the adults looked as though they were searching for something. For some reason, only Natsuki was outside the storehouse, not even holding an umbrella. She was facing away from them, and she looked like she was hanging her head. The ones who just left, Genji, Nanjo, and Natsuki. The ones who had left before them, Kanon, Eva, and Hideyoshi, made this a large gathering of people. There was absolutely no bustle of activity. When Natsuki realized the children had come, a terrible expression rose her face. She ran at them with her arms open wide. Yeah, that's gonna make them not come over. However, no, because of that, they saw the scene which Natsuki was trying to keep them away from. Inside the storehouse with the shutter wide open, a flickering fluorescent light shone down. I'm not quite sure what's going to be here, but I'm going to put a warning that there might be some triggering stuff happening in a few seconds. Over there. The fact that the song is called Golden Slaughterer is not a good sign. Jessica's piercing shriek ran out. That was just because Jessica's scream was the loudest. The same thing spilled out of Battler and George's notes as well. Eva, just like Natsuki, spread her arms and with a terrible expression roared at the kids. Natsuki spread her arms. One might have thought she was trying to prevent them from advancing any further. However, right now, that wasn't why Eva was spreading her arms. She was trying to hide the terrible scene from the kids. It was her mother's heart, trying to protect the eyes and hearts of his children by attempting to block her view of that terrible scene by at least the width of one of her arms. I had seen this kind of cheap scene all too often. Manga, TV, anime, and movies, I'd seen it over and over again. This was just seeing something appear in real life that I'd seen plenty of times before in some of those more sensational movies, wasn't it? That alone shouldn't... but that suit, it's that old bastard's, isn't it? I get it then. That's Uncle Kraus and Kyrie-san and Auntie Rosa. Okay, so they've been dead for at least 6 hours. It's now after 8, so at least since 2, we know that even the others went to bed at midnight. So between just after midnight and about 2 a.m., and we have mutilation of their bodies post-death.
いや、めったなことは言え。私は町医者だ。検視は専門外だ。
ちゅうことは何や。殺しただけじゃ飽き足らず、さらにこんな無体なことをしたん言うんか。悪魔の所業や。
Not Natsumi caught Jessica in her arms, not to Eva caught George Anarchy. So I was the only one who could approach the entrance to the storehouse. If only there had been someone here to catch me, too. I wouldn't have needed to see this horrible, evil scene burned into my eyes. No, that's not it. I'm standing here not because the people who would catch me aren't here, because the people who would catch me are right there. Just as Jessica had said, it did look like the storehouse used to keep gardening tools. A lawnmower and its replacement blades, brass sickle and a hammer, a saw and some construction tools, piled up potted plants and bags of fertilizer. And treated just the same, the corpses of several people had been laid to rest there. No, had been thrown in there. I could tell them by their clothes. That old bastard, Kiryu-san, Uncle Kraus and Auntie Rosa. Further back, Koda-san, and there's still more of them? How many people died? Fucking hell, I can't even count them on one hand, god fucking damn it. I didn't know whether it had been one of those gardening tools, if used for something other than their intended purpose, could definitely be wielded with a naked brutality. Whether some horrible tool had been brought in here specifically for this. Whatever the case, the bodies lying about here, each of them had been given an atrocious makeover. This isn't a damn makeover, it's more like their faces have been plowed. Their faces were smashed, forced into an expression that a normal person couldn't make even after death. I couldn't tell where the eyes or the nose were, but I could find the mouth because it was gaping wide, the ridges of the teeth exposed. But the front teeth were missing, even the cheek that should have been covered was all torn up and exposed. Stylish makeup that he'd spent way too much time fussing over for a guy is no help at all. Trying to shut out my reckless words, Jessica tried to fill her ears with the sound of her own screaming.
よすんだ、バタラ君。
Disregarding age and appearance, I fell to my knees, clinging to Anaki's waist and sobbing, as if I was crying on behalf of everyone there, representing the feelings of everyone there. I screamed over and over.
O 父さん、倒れているのはクラウスおじさん、ルドルフおじさん、キリエおばさんに、ローザおばさん、ゴーダさんで5人。
いや、6人や。ここにもう。
That Hideyoshi was looking down on now was hidden in the shadow of a mountain of random objects. A blind spot to George, he stood by the entrance. So George couldn't tell whose body it was. Therefore, George cursed himself. He cursed that part of himself that imagines the worst and is always right.
じゃあ、お父さんの足元に倒れているのはシャノンなんだね。
ああ、シャノンちゃんや。
George was completely silent. He shook slightly, his lower lip trembling. He wanted to run up to his beloved, screaming and crying, but, before rashly running up to her, he mustered all of his strength and asked his father.
シャノンもクラウスおじさんたちと同じなのかな。
Hideyoshi deeply understood the meaning of those words, so he couldn't give George a quick answer. No, he thought that to George right now that was the only possible sincere and loving response. George had asked whether she was the same, then to ask whether her corpse was the same as the others. Since Hideyoshi hadn't denied it, it meant that the body was just as horrible.
シャノンを見てもいいかな。
いや、あかん。
どうして？だってもう二度とシャノンの顔を見られないんだよ。その最後の顔、どうして見たらいけないんだよ。
お前が最後にシャノンちゃんに会ったのは昨日か。
うん。
そうか。そのシャノンちゃんは別れ際にお前にどんな顔を見せたんや。
素敵な。
After receiving the ring, she was bewildered even though her heart should have been decided. Bashful, and so embarrassed to show him that face that she ran away. That expression was revived in George's mind.
そうか。ならシャノンちゃんもその笑顔をお前に残したいと願うはず。
Hideyoshi looked down upon Shannon's body lying at his feet. Just like the other bodies, it was in such a horrible state that it would make anyone want to cover their eyes. Half of the face had been smashed off, and no more than half of her expression remained. If that remaining half, soaked red with blood, had been wiped clean, a graceful, smiling face might have peeked out. Only half of it. Without thinking, Hideyoshi slapped his hand over his eyes. How cruel. If only all of it had been crushed. If they were going to crush it, then they might as well have been able to deceive George's heart for a while by saying that it was just someone else wearing Shannon's clothes. Yet they had left half of the face. It caused the body so much humiliation, and also made it clear that this body was none other than Shannon. How inhuman, how monstrous. There at Hideyoshi's feet, trying his best to burn the image of the remaining half of Shannon's expression into his eyes, was Cannon. Cannon was not crying. Tears had risen to his eyes, but he did not let them drip down. That didn't mean he wasn't feeling as much sadness as everyone else. Losing Shannon, who had lived with him in the gospel house, and he had loved as a sister, must have been just the same as losing a blood relative.
ジョージ、シャノンちゃんはきっとありがとう言うてお前に恥ずかしいところを見られとうなかったんや。きっとお前が耐えてくれたこと感謝しとるで。
分かってる。 わかってるよ、父さん。わかってるよ。
George leaned against the outside wall of the storehouse, sinking down
父
powerlessly.
さん、頼みがあるんだ。
なんや。
僕の代わりに、シャノンは指に、指輪をつけてるかな。
指輪？ちょいと見てみる。
Hideyoshi crouched down. As he did, Cannon silently pointed to one of Shannon's hands.
ある。こりゃ、ダイヤの指輪や。クズダイヤとちゃう。なかなかの値打ちもんや。
それは、どっちの手の、どの指にあるのかな。
と、左手の薬指や。そっか、シャノンちゃん、婚約しとったんか。
ジョージ、あなた、まさか。
エヴァ、今はそんなん関係ないで。シャノンちゃんは男に将来を約束されとったんや。一生を幸せにしちゃると男に言わせたんや。それが誰かは問題とちゃうで。男にそこまで言わしめて、女の本懐やないか。いつこの指輪をもらったんかは知らん。誰が渡したかも知らん。だが、それでも、シャノンちゃんは指輪をもらえたんや。そして、それを受け入れ、左の薬指に通したんや。指輪を送った男もきっと喜んだんとちゃうか？
To most of the people there, Hideyoshi was simply disturbed by this extraordinary situation and was blurting out strange things. For those who really knew the truth about George and Shin's relationship, everything he said made sense.
そっか。ありがとう、父さん。
George stood up. Traces of tears still streaked his face, but his expression had returned to its usual calm.
行こう、バトラ君、ジェシカちゃん。これ以上、僕たちがここにいると、大人の邪魔になる。
そうだな。
Jessica sniffled once. Trying to say she was all right, she showed her face to her mother, who'd been holding her the whole time. She faced George again. She once again had on her usual face, although she still couldn't recover her smile.
バトラー、しっかり。
Battler kept on crouching in front of his parents' bodies.
すまねえな。がっつり泣いたら落ち着いたぜ。親父の野郎。普段はクソクソ言ってるくせに。ちょっと死んじまったくらいでピーピー泣くんじゃねえぜ。仕方ねえだろ。親が死んだら泣くように。遺伝子すり込まれちまってったからよ。
Battler's face was still bright red from the tears. Even though it was forced, it at least recovered enough to fake a smile.
カノン、お前もこれ以上ここにいてはいけません。子供たちを連れて。
Natsuhi, unable to take a step into the storehouse, had been standing under the rain the whole time. Maybe she had her own way of grieving, different from Battler's. She realized that she had to take on a sense of responsibility now that her husband was dead. So she gave Cannon those orders.
奥様。
Cannon rose silently and turned to face them. His face was pure white, almost as though his own heart had died along with Shannon. There was no life in his expression. During the course of a normal day, he had been instructed to do a tour of the beautiful rose garden. Cannon may have led the way for them. But now, there was no distinction between Cannon and the children. They were now just kids of the same age, with wounds of having lost someone close to them. Just seeing the children go back, Natsuki gave the orders to Genji.
すぐに警察に連絡しなさい。台風が通り過ぎるまでは来られないでしょうか。どうすればいいか指示を与えてくれるはずです。
わかりました。防災用の無線機がありますので、それで連絡します。
When she heard that, Natsuki remembered. That's right, the telephones were out today, weren't they? However, since it had been assumed that there could be trouble with phones in this isolated island, a radio had been installed. Anyway, let's contact the police and seek their instructions. Everything else can wait.
もうこの場はどうしようもありませんか。
残念ながら私には何もできませんな。
わかりました。エンジ、せめて主人たちの顔を。 このような姿を晒すことは当人にとっても。
はい。
Kenji picked up several towels hanging around inside the storehouse. Eva stopped him in a shrill
ちょっ
voice.
とちょっと、お待ちなさいよ。ここは犯行現場なんでしょ。なら変に手を加えちゃダメよ。私たちは混乱してて現場に土足で踏み入っちゃったけど、それはきっと警察の捜査の邪魔になったわよ。
So he glared at Eva testily. Objectively speaking, Eva was right. Even so, she glared at Eva as though accusing her of refusing to do those tragic corpses, which had been humiliated even after death, the simple kindness of covering their faces. However, Eva had spoken both calmly and correctly. This horrible state was definitely not an accident. It was a crime. Someone had killed them. It was a murder case. In that case, they should be careful not to further disturb the site. They had to aid the police as much as possible so that they might hand over a clue used to find the detestable culprit.
エヴァさんに賛成。警察が来るまでここは手つかずにしておくべきです。奥様、いかがなさいますか。
そうですね、わかりました。ここを閉ざしなさい。それから念のためここに別の施錠をするように。
別の施錠？
ええ、ここに来た時シャッターの鍵は閉じていました。ということはシャッターの鍵を使い犯人が施錠したということです。
確かに通りや。じゃあここを開けた限り犯人の指紋が残ってるんとちゃうんか。
警察に証拠として提出する価値はあるでしょうけど、カノン君が普通に持ってここを開けるのに使用しちゃったわ。多分カノン君の指紋も付着しちゃってるわよ。そしてその鍵はさっき源氏さんに手渡され、源氏さんも素手で受け取ってる。大した証拠にはなりそうにないわね。
それは不用心でした。申し訳ございません。
源氏さん、この倉庫の鍵は他にもあるんか。
いいえ、この一つだけです。
ということは犯人はその鍵を使用人室から持ち出し、そして律儀に元の場所に戻したちゅうことになるな。
Yoshi's theory sounded plausible, but was actually very strange if you thought about it. Why would they go to all the trouble of returning the key they stole? Now, if you think about it even more deeply, there are some even more bizarre points. Usually when a criminal hides a body, they're trying to delay the point at which it will be found and use that time to escape. The actual place where the six were killed wasn't necessarily here, but they had been killed somewhere on this island. Normal to think that the reason they had been carried to the storehouse was to hide the bodies until the late post-discovery of the crime. But the graffiti drawn on the shutter that looked like an eerie magic circle, it eloquently indicated that the corpses were hidden here. It didn't specifically say they were here, but after 6 people had gone missing, and making such an obvious scribble and even returning the key to open it, it seemed almost as though they'd wanted the corpses to be discovered here.
とにかく一度は犯人が開け閉めをした施錠だけでは信用できない。犯人の手からもこの場所を保護する意味で施錠を新たにしたいと言っているのです。
いい案だと思います。私も。
And he fished around inside the storehouse and unsealed a brand new padlock which had been inside a small box.
どうなさいますか。
私が持ちましょう。責任を持って警察に手渡します。
Natsui took the key to the padlock from Genji's hand, so that they all exited and lowered the shutter. So that the 6 corpses were now once again sealed behind that shutter, the gruesome magic circle. Genji crouched in front of the shutter and fastened the new padlock. In addition to the main lock and the shutter, there was sometimes a place where you could attach your own lock in front of it. This was one of those types. Amidst the roar of thunder and the pouring rain, the storehouse stood there ominously. Its closed shutter was a magic circle drawn in a creepy, blood-like substance swallowing up the bodies of 6 whole people. Natsuhi, putting the new lock on, may not have been entirely to preserve the scene for the police, but rather she might have felt like she wanted to shut that mouth for all eternity, to prevent any more victims from being swallowed by that eerie demon.
行きましょう、ミナンチョ先生。ご足労をありがとうございました。源氏は急いで警察に連絡を。
戻りましたらすぐに連絡します。
The adults left the storehouse. Ghastly magic circle drawn on the shutter, still swallowing the 6 bodies, loomed eerily, occasionally lit up by the lightning. It's now 8:45. And I think that would be a good place to stop for tonight.